Have you ever stopped to wonder why there's so much suffering and temptation in the world? Where does that invisible force come from, the one that seems to push humanity away from the divine? The story of the Watchers, as told in the ancient book of Enoch, offers a unique and profound perspective on these very questions. These angels, who once served in the heavens, made decisions that altered the very course of creation, and understanding their narrative can fundamentally transform the way you perceive good, evil, and your own spiritual path. Before we delve in, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. That way, you won't miss any of the content that's designed to strengthen your faith and deepen your understanding of the scriptures. Every video here is a genuine opportunity for spiritual growth. So settle in, relax, adjust your volume, and let's begin. Night descended upon the tents like a heavy shroud, drawing Enoch into slumber. But there was something in the air that night, a palpable vibration he couldn't quite name, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. He rose slowly, careful not to wake his wife, and stepped outside. The stars blazed with an unnatural intensity, almost painful to behold, and for a fleeting moment, he had the distinct feeling that they were watching him. It wasn't fear he felt, but something far deeper, a certainty that something ancient, something that had been dormant since before creation itself, was awakening. In his chest, an unease blossomed like a seed planted in fertile ground. He closed his eyes and saw visions. Mountains that walked, stars falling from the sky like overripe fruit, and an abyss that whispered his name with chilling familiarity. When he opened his eyes, everything appeared the same, but he knew, with a certainty that defied explanation, that his life was about to change forever. The days that followed were filled with the meticulous study of parchments and genealogies. Enoch had learned to chart the heavens, to track the turning of the seasons, and to record the names of his ancestors with a precision few possessed. His father had taught him that each name was a story, each generation a link in the chain that bound man to the Creator. But lately, something felt broken in that chain. Violence was sprouting like weeds among the tribes. Men no longer settled their disputes with words, but with stones and clubs. Women mourned their sons, lost before their time, and the elders spoke in hushed tones of better days, days that might never return. From his tent, Enoch witnessed all of this, spending countless hours copying and recopying the stories entrusted to him. At times, he wondered if anyone would ever read what he wrote, if his words would carry any weight against the encroaching chaos. Yet, he continued to write because it was the only thing he knew how to do, the only thing that gave his life meaning in a world that seemed to be crumbling around him. One afternoon, as he meticulously traced the lines of a genealogy, he felt that familiar whisper again, that invisible presence that had visited him in his dreams. He raised his eyes to the horizon and gazed at the distant mountains, seemingly immutable and eternal. But deep within, something told him that those mountains would soon bear witness to events that would change the destiny of all creation. He didn't know what role he would play in it all, but he sensed that his quill, his ability to record and preserve, would be more important than he could ever imagine. And so, he continued to write with trembling but steady hands, aware that each word was a seed planted for an uncertain future. Samjaza remained on the threshold, that liminal space where the sky kissed the earth without ever truly merging. From his vantage point, he could see both worlds. The eternal radiance of divine glory at his back and, below, the fragile and beautiful earth, teeming with life that pulsed with an intensity he had never known. He had been appointed as a watcher, a guardian of that invisible boundary, and for eons, he had performed his duty without question. But something had shifted within him. Perhaps it was the first time he saw a woman laughing by the river, or the way children ran among the wildflowers, or simply the fact that, after so long of merely observing, he had begun to feel. And feeling, for a being created to obey, was a dangerous thing. Azazel approached him with that smile that always foreshadowed trouble. There wasn't malice in his eyes, but curiosity, that spark that could transform obedience into questioning. He spoke of power, of knowledge, of the possibility of being more than mere observers. Azazel, what if we could be more, Samjaza? What if we could experience life, not just witness it? He spoke of affection, of what it meant to touch and be touched, to experience life instead of simply safeguarding it. Samjaza listened in silence, feeling each word resonate in a place deep within his being that he didn't know existed. He knew that crossing that line meant betraying everything he was, everything he had been created for, but he also knew that he could no longer remain just a witness. He longed to be part of that story, not just its guardian. The summit of Mount Hermon rose majestically under a cloudless sky. 200 angels gathered there, each bearing the same mixture of determination and fear on their faces. Samjaza looked at them one by one, recognizing in each gaze the same yearning that burned within his own chest. He knew that what they were about to do was irreversible, that once the oath was spoken, their fates would be sealed forever. But he also knew that none of them could do it alone, that they needed the strength of the collective pack to dare to take that step. And so he spoke with a firm voice, though inside he trembled. Samjaza, brothers, we stand at a precipice. Before us lies a path forbidden, a transgression against the divine order. But I see in your eyes the same hunger that gnaws at my own soul, the desire to experience, to know, to live. We cannot turn back from this longing. We must bind ourselves together, so that none can falter and leave the others exposed to the wrath of the heavens. He proposed a binding oath, one that would unite them all in the same fate, so that none could turn back and leave the others exposed to punishment. Samjaza, all for all, this I propose, a bond unbreakable. Will you join me? And the words hung in the air like an irrevocable decree. One by one, they pronounced the oath, and with each voice that joined, the weight of what they were doing became more real and more terrifying. There was no jubilation in that moment, only a profound solemnity, the awareness that they were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. When the last of them had spoken, an eerie silence fell upon the mountain. The wind stopped blowing. The birds ceased to sing, and for a moment, it seemed that all of creation held its breath, waiting to see what consequences that act of rebellion would bring. Samjaza looked down at the valley where men lived and felt a mixture of anticipation and terror. They had chosen love, or at least what they believed was love. Soon they would discover the price of that choice. They descended like falling stars, but without the roar of celestial fire. They arrived gently, almost timidly, like one who approaches something sacred that they fear to defile. The women saw them first, at dusk, tall, luminous figures walking among the fields with a grace that did not belong to this world. Some men fled, others prostrated themselves, but the women, those who had awakened the longing in immortal hearts, stood still, sensing deep within their beings that something extraordinary was happening. There was no violence in those first encounters, but a mutual fascination, a recognition of beauty that transcended the physical. The watchers discovered what it meant to be vulnerable, to feel the accelerated beating of the heart at a smile, the tremor of the hands when touching another's skin. And the women, for their part, experienced an intensity of affection that they had never known, a devotion that seemed capable of moving mountains. Unions were consummated under starry skies, in hidden valleys, by rivers that murmured ancient songs. They were moments of stolen tenderness, of whispered promises, of the illusion that love could justify any transgression. But the universe does not forgive so easily, and what seemed like an act of freedom would soon reveal its true cost. Azazel was not content with affection. He had come to Earth with a more ambitious purpose, with the conviction that humans deserved more than the ignorance in which they had been left. And so he began to teach. He showed men how to extract metal from stones, how to forge swords and spears that cut with lethal precision. He taught them to create shields and armor, to manufacture bracelets and necklaces that enhanced beauty, but also awakened envy. Each lesson was a poisoned gift, because with knowledge came also the ability to destroy. Other watchers followed his example. Kokabeel revealed the secrets of the constellations. He taught how to read the future in the movement of the stars. Barakil instructed in the art of interpreting lightning and omens from the sky. Armoros shared enchantments that could break curses, and Tamiel, the signs that opened doors to hidden dimensions. Enoch watched all of this from his tent, recording each teaching with a trembling hand. He saw how knowledge transformed his people, but not always for the better. The swords that were meant to protect were used to conquer. The ornaments that were meant to embellish became symbols of status and division. The astrology that was meant to guide became an instrument of manipulation and fear. Each forbidden art brought with it a shadow, and that shadow grew day by day, spreading over the earth like an unstoppable stain. Enoch watched and wrote, aware that he was documenting not only the rise of humanity, but also the beginning of its deepest fall. And at night, when silence enveloped his tent, he could hear the whisper of the abyss growing closer, ever more real. The wombs grew with unnatural speed. The women who had lain with the watchers felt from the first moment that something was different. The pregnancy did not bring the expected sweetness, but an overwhelming weight, as if they carried mountains inside instead of children. Some died in childbirth, their fragile bodies unable to withstand what they were bringing into the world. Others survived, but were marked forever, with empty gazes that spoke of horrors that no tongue could describe. And when they were born, when those beings saw the light of day for the first time, the earth trembled. They were giants, creatures of impossible proportions, with a strength that surpassed that of 100 men combined. At first, they seemed like children playing among the fields, tearing up trees as if they were twigs. But hunger arrived soon, an insatiable hunger that no common food could satisfy. They began to devour everything they found. Entire herds disappeared in a single meal. Crops that were supposed to feed entire villages were consumed in a matter of hours. And when the animals and plants were no longer enough, they turned to men. Villages were razed, families destroyed, and the cry of the innocent rose to the heavens like a desperate clamor. The Nephilim knew no mercy, because in them the divine had been mixed with the earthly in a way that creation had never foreseen. They were aberrations, children of a forbidden union, and their mere existence was an open wound in the order of the universe. Enoch walked among the ruins of what had once been a prosperous city. The bodies lay scattered like fallen leaves, and the smell of death permeated the air. He knelt next to a child who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, with his eyes open, staring at a sky that he would no longer see. Something broke inside him at that moment, something that could not be repaired with words or genealogies. He took his quill with trembling hands and began to write. But this time it was not names or dates that flowed from his ink. It was a cry, a plea, the voice of the earth itself crying out for justice. He wrote about the spilled blood that soaked the ground, about the widows who wept inconsolably, about the orphans who wandered aimlessly. He wrote about the giants who devoured without pity, and about the watchers who had brought this curse upon the world. And as he wrote, he felt that he was not alone, that his quill was guided by something greater than himself, that his words were the echo of a universal cry that demanded to be heard. The earth groaned under the weight of violence, and that groan ascended like incense toward the celestial throne. Enoch knew that what he was writing was not just a historical record, but a formal accusation, a testimony that would be presented before the highest court. Each letter was a drop of innocent blood, each word a cry for delayed justice. And when he finished, when the last phrase was captured on the parchment, he raised his eyes to the sky and whispered a prayer that was half hope, half despair, because he knew that judgment would come as surely as night follows day. But he also knew that that judgment would bring with it a terrible price, one that perhaps all of humanity would have to pay. The cry had been heard. Now all that remained was to await the answer. In the heights, where light casts no shadows and time folds in on itself, for figures gathered. Michael, with his sword ever ready, looked down with a grave expression. Uriel, whose face seemed forged in fire and ice, held in his hands the records of every transgression. Raphael, the healer, felt in his own being the pain of the wounded earth, and Gabriel, the messenger, waited in silence, knowing that soon he would have to deliver words that would change the course of history. There was no anger in their faces, but something deeper, an infinite sadness at the corruption of what had been created. Michael was the first to speak, and his voice resonated like contained thunder. He recalled the order established from the beginning, the boundaries that should not be crossed, the laws that sustained the very structure of creation. Uriel unfurled the celestial parchments, where each act of violence, each drop of spilled blood, each tear of widow and orphan, was recorded with relentless precision. Raphael spoke of the suffering that spread like disease, of how the earth itself was being poisoned by the presence of the Nephilim. And Gabriel posed the question that they all carried in their hearts. How long? How much longer would the Most High allow injustice to reign unanswered? The silence that followed was dense, charged with meaning. They all knew that the moment had come to act, that divine patience, though vast as the ocean, had its limits. But they also knew that any intervention would bring with it consequences that would extend for generations. It was not just a matter of punishing the guilty, but of restoring balance, of healing what had been broken. And for that, they needed an intermediary, someone who could speak both the language of heaven and that of earth. Uriel descended, shrouded in a light that did not burn, but made it impossible to look directly at him. He found Enoch by the river, washing the ink from his fingers, his face marked by sleepless nights. The angel did not need to announce himself. His mere presence was enough for Enoch to fall to his knees, not out of fear, but out of the overwhelming weight of the sacred. But Uriel raised him gently, and in that gesture there was an unexpected tenderness, the recognition of a soul that had remained faithful in the midst of chaos. He spoke to him with words that were both sound and light, explaining that he had been chosen for a task that no other human could fulfill. He had to ascend, he had to appear before the celestial council, he had to speak in the name of the men who suffered under the yoke of the giants. Enoch was stunned. He, a simple scribe, a counter of genealogies? How could he stand before beings of unimaginable glory? Enoch, but I am just a man, a scribe, nothing more. How can I speak for humanity before the celestial council? But Uriel reminded him that precisely for that reason he had been chosen, because he knew human pain, because he had recorded every injustice, because his heart still beat with compassion when others had already hardened. Uriel, you have witnessed the suffering, Enoch. You have recorded the injustices. Your heart remains open to the pain of humanity. That is why you have been chosen. The Watchers will also plead their case, seeking forgiveness or understanding. You must be there to remember the victims, to give voice to those who can no longer speak. He explained that the Watchers would also request a hearing, that they would try to justify their actions, that they would seek forgiveness or at least understanding, and that someone had to be there to remember the victims, to give voice to those who could no longer speak. Enoch nodded slowly, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a cloak. He didn't know if he was prepared, but he knew that he could not refuse. And so, when Uriel extended his hand, he took it without hesitation, and together they began to ascend, leaving behind the groaning earth and the heavens that awaited the verdict. Samjaza appeared before the council with his head held high, but his hands trembled. It was not pride that sustained his posture, but the last spark of dignity he had left. He knew that there was no excuse for what he had done, but at least he wanted them to understand why. He spoke with a firm voice at first, explaining that for eons he had observed humanity from a distance, seeing its fragility and its beauty, its capacity to love and to create in the midst of mortality. He told them that he had begun to feel something he had never experienced before, the desire to be part of that story, to touch and be touched, to know what it meant to truly live and not just exist in the immutable perfection of heaven. His voice broke when he spoke of the women he had loved, not with lust, but with a tenderness that he believed genuine. He tried to explain that it had not been just carnal desire, but a deep longing for connection, to experience what humans called love. But as he spoke, the words began to sound hollow, even to himself, because he knew, deep down, that true love does not destroy, does not devastate, does not leave behind a trail of blood and tears. He looked at Enoch, who remained silent with eyes full of compassion, but also of firmness, and saw reflected in that human face the price of his choice. He then attempted another, more desperate defense. He spoke of the fear of divine abandonment, of the feeling that perhaps the Creator had forgotten them, that their role as watchers was meaningless if they could only observe without intervening. Samjaza, we watched, we guarded, for eons. But what purpose did it serve? Did the Creator truly see us? Or had we become nothing more than forgotten sentinels? We saw humanity struggling, suffering, and we felt a yearning to help, to guide. Perhaps we were wrong, but our intentions were not born of malice. He suggested that perhaps they had acted out of compassion, wanting to elevate humanity, to share knowledge that could improve their lives. But even as he spoke these words, he knew that they were pious lies that he told himself in order not to face the darker truth, that he had chosen his own desire above the established order, and that choice had unleashed a catastrophe. The silence that followed his defense was more eloquent than any accusation. Samjaza lowered his head and, for the first time since he had descended, wept. The voice that pronounced the verdict did not belong to any of the 4 archangels, but seemed to emanate from the throne itself, resonating in every corner of creation. It was a voice that did not admit of reply, that contained within itself the authority of the one who had shaped the universe with a word. The decree was threefold and definitive. First, Azazel would be chained and cast into Dudiel, a place of absolute darkness where he would await the final judgment. Sharp, jagged stones would fall upon him, and darkness would be his only company until the great day when all accounts would be settled. Second, the Nephilim would be destroyed, not by direct divine hand, but by inciting them to self-destruction, so that they would devour each other until none remained. The earth would be cleansed of their presence, and their memory erased as ink is erased from a parchment. Third, and this was the most painful for Samjaza and the other watchers, there would be no forgiveness. They would see their offspring die, they would witness the destruction they had caused, and then they would be chained in places of torment until the end of time. There would be no second chance, there would be no redemption, because their transgression had not been the result of ignorance but of conscious choice. They had known the law and broken it. They had seen the consequences and still persisted. Michael received the order to prepare the execution of the decree. Raphael was commissioned to chain Azazel. Gabriel was to announce to Noah what was to come, and Uriel had the task of ensuring that everything was recorded, so that future generations would know what happens when boundaries are crossed. Established by the Creator. Enoch mourned all this with a broken heart, for he understood both the justice of the verdict and the tragedy of the fallen. Famine arrived like a silent plague. The fields that once overflowed with wheat now offered only cracked earth. The flocks had been decimated, devoured by the Nephilim in their endless feasts. And when there was nothing left to eat, when the very earth seemed to refuse to yield fruit, the giants looked at each other with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw brothers but flesh. The first battle erupted near the river, where 2 clans of Nephilim fought over the last fish. What began as an altercation turned into a massacre. The giants fought with a ferocity that surpassed any human violence, tearing off limbs, destroying each other with a force that made the earth tremble. The remaining humans hid in caves, terrified, watching as those beings who had once seemed like gods were now destroying each other. Enoch recorded each battle from a distance with a shrinking heart. He saw in that self-destruction the invisible hand of the celestial decree, justice being fulfilled inexorably. The cities that the Nephilim had built with their supernatural strength now lay in burning ruins in the fratricidal wars. Battlefields stretched across entire valleys covered in gigantic corpses that even the vultures dared not touch. And while the giants killed each other, the surviving humans tried to rebuild some semblance of normality, knowing that each day could be their last. Some prayed to a god who seemed to have distanced himself. Others simply awaited the end with resignation. But all felt that something was changing, that this was the agony of one era and the painful birth of another. The sky itself seemed darker, as if all creation were mourning what had been and what was to come. Raphael descended to the desert of Dudiel with the solemnity of one who executes an irrevocable sentence. Azazel awaited him, not with resistance, but with a bitter acceptance. He had seen the Nephilim die. He had witnessed how his teachings became instruments of destruction, and something within him had broken definitively. When Raphael extended the celestial chains, Azazel did not fight. He allowed himself to be bound with a docility that contrasted with his former arrogance. The chains were not of common metal, but of something deeper, something that bound not only the body, but also the very essence of the being. Raphael led him to a crack in the earth, a place where the light had never reached and never would. There, in the depths of Dudiel, he threw him with a force that echoed in dimensions that humans could not perceive. Then he began to cover the entrance with rough stones, each one weighed down with the weight of divine justice. Azazel felt the darkness close over him like a shroud. There was no physical pain, but something worse. The absolute awareness of what he had lost, of what he had destroyed, of what he could never repair. In that total darkness, without time or space, only memory remained. And that memory was his true torment. He remembered the light of the sky he had abandoned. He remembered the faces of those he had taught and who now lay dead. He remembered every choice that had led him there. Raphael sealed the last stone and pronounced words that resonated in the abyss until the day of judgment, until all accounts were settled, until the universe itself was renewed. Only then would that prison be opened. Azazel heard the words and closed his eyes, although in that darkness there was no difference between opening or closing them. And in the absolute silence of Dudiel, a wait that would last millennia began. Noah awoke startled, his heart pounding against his chest like a drum. He had dreamed of water, so much water that it covered entire mountains, erasing cities as if they had never existed. In the dream, he saw animals entering in pairs into a wooden shelter. He saw the sky open like a wound. He saw his family clinging to boards while the world they knew disappeared beneath the waves. He rose trembling and went outside, where night still reigned. The stars shone normally, the air was dry, there was no sign of rain, but the dream had been so vivid, so real, that he could not dismiss it as mere fantasy. Uriel appeared to him at dawn when Noah was by the well trying to make sense of his visions. The angel did not need to explain much. He simply confirmed what Noah already intuited deep within his being. A deluge would come, a total purification, a reset of creation. And he, Noah, had been chosen to preserve a remnant, to be the bridge between the corrupt world that was dying and the renewed world that would be born from the waters. Uriel showed him images that unfolded in the air like living scrolls, oxen representing the righteous, stars falling symbolizing the watchers, waters rising to cover everything. They were symbols that Noah did not fully understand, but that Enoch would record with precision in his writings. The task seemed impossible. To build an ark of gigantic dimensions, to gather animals of every species, to convince his family that the world, as they knew it, was about to end. But Noah nodded because in his heart he knew he had no other choice. It was this or perish along with everything else. Then Uriel gave him precise instructions on measurements and materials, on how to seal the wood to withstand the pressure of the water, on how much time he had before the judgment began, and then he disappeared, leaving Noah alone with a mission that would change the destiny of all life on earth. Enoch knew that his time on earth was coming to an end. He felt it in his bones, in the way the material world seemed increasingly translucent, less solid. He had fulfilled his mission, he had recorded the transgressions, he had spoken before the celestial council, he had transmitted the divine decrees. Now there remained one last task, the most personal. He gathered his family under the large tree that grew next to his tent. His sons looked at him with a mixture of reverence and sadness, for they all knew that something was changing in him. He spoke to them in a serene voice, without drama, explaining that he would soon depart and that they should not fear. He gave them the scrolls he had written, the records of all that he had witnessed, and made them promise that they would preserve them, that they would transmit them to future generations, because those words were not only history, but warning and hope. A warning of what happens when established boundaries are crossed, and the hope that even in the midst of the most severe judgment, there is always a remnant that is preserved. He embraced each of his children, feeling the fragility of their mortal bodies against his own, which was already beginning to transform. He told them that he loved them, that he was proud of them, that they should remain faithful no matter what came. And then, as the sun set painting the sky orange and purple, he began to walk towards the horizon. His steps became lighter with each meter, his body more luminous. His family followed him with their eyes, watching as he walked away until he became a point of light that ascended towards the sky. And then he was simply gone. There was no tomb to mark, no body to bury. Enoch had been taken, snatched from this world to serve in another plane of existence. And those who remained behind looked at each other with tears in their eyes, but also with a strange peace, knowing that their father had not died, but had been transformed. The first day was just a drizzle. Noah and his family were already inside the ark with the animals accommodated in their compartments when the first drops began to fall. Some neighbors mocked from a distance, shouting what a waste of wood, what madness to build a boat on dry land. But on the second day the drizzle turned into a downpour, and on the third the downpour into a deluge. The sky opened as if someone had torn a veil, and the water fell with a violence that had never been seen before. It was not normal rain. It was as if the oceans of the sky were emptying all at once upon the earth. The laughter of the neighbors turned into cries of panic as the water began to rise. First to their ankles, then to their knees, then to their waists. They ran towards higher ground, carrying their children, dragging what little they could save. But the water pursued them relentlessly and inexorably. Inside the ark, Noah and his family heard the desperate blows on the hull, the pleas of those who now wanted to enter, but for whom it was already too late. Noah clenched his fists, tears rolling down his face, because each blow was a reminder that salvation has a moment, a window that closes when judgment arrives. It was not cruelty that sealed the door, but the natural consequence of decisions made over years. The ark was now rocking, lifted by waters that continued to rise. The fountains of the abyss opened, gushing from the depths of the earth, joining the rains of the sky in a destructive embrace. Mountains that had seemed eternal were submerged. Entire valleys disappeared under a liquid mantle that did not distinguish between guilty and innocent. And inside the ark, in the midst of the external chaos, there reigned an overwhelming silence. The animals remained strangely calm, as if they understood that they were being preserved for a greater purpose. Noah knelt and prayed, not asking for the judgment to cease, because he knew that it was necessary, but asking for strength to bear the weight of being the only one who had believed in time. On the summit of Mount Hermon, where it had all begun, the watchers who were still free gathered one last time. From there they could see the water rise, covering everything that had once been familiar. Samasa remained in the center, his gaze fixed on the valley where he had lived with the woman he loved, now buried under meters of murky water. Around him, the other watchers remained silent, each lost in his own memories and regrets. They watched the last Nephilim, their children, trying to stay afloat, using their supernatural strength to climb to the highest peaks. But even the highest mountains were being reached by the waters. One by one, the giants disappeared, their cries drowning in the roar of the flood, and the watchers, immortal and impotent, could only watch. There was nothing they could do, no power they could invoke to stop what they themselves had unleashed. Sem-Jaza fell to his knees when he saw the last of the Nephilim sink, a young giant who had inherited his eyes. The cry that erupted from his throat was not of words, but of pure pain, a lament that resonated in dimensions that humans could not perceive. It was the cry of one who understands too late the price of his choices, of one who sees destroyed all that he loved by his own hand. The other watchers joined his lament, and for a moment Mount Hermon became a chorus of celestial agony. They did not ask for forgiveness because they knew there would be none. They did not ask for mercy because they understood that justice must be fulfilled. They only lamented, with a pain that transcended time, the beauty they had corrupted and the lives they had destroyed. And as they lamented, the chains began to materialize, binding them one by one, preparing them for the long captivity that awaited them in the depths of the earth. The chains were not of iron or bronze, but of something that bound the very essence of their being. The watchers were dragged to deep places, caverns that existed beyond physical geography, spaces where time moved strangely and darkness had weight. There, in the abyss, they would await the great day of judgment. There was no physical torture, no fire to burn their immortal bodies. The torment was of another nature, the full awareness of what they had lost and what they had caused, reproduced again and again in their minds without possibility of forgetting. Samasa lay chained in a crack where occasionally a ray of light filtered through. Those moments were the worst because the light brought memories. He remembered the face of the woman he had loved, her laughter, the way her eyes shone when she looked at him. He remembered the promises he had made to her, promises that now sounded like cruel lies. He remembered his children, the Nephilim, and how at first he had felt pride in seeing them grow strong. He had not foreseen that that strength would become a curse, that those children would devour the world and then devour each other. In the darkness he tried to pray, but the words choked him. To whom could a fallen angel plead? What forgiveness could he ask for, who had known the glory of heaven and yet had chosen rebellion? Sometimes, in the absolute silence of the abyss, he heard the laments of the other watchers, distant echoes of shared pain. And in those moments, he understood that their punishment was not only individual but collective, that they would all carry together the weight of what they had done. The oath they had pronounced on Herman, that all for all, had been fulfilled in the most bitter way possible. They had fallen together, and together they would remain chained until the end of time. There was no escape, no redemption, only the endless wait for a judgment whose date only the Most High knew. When the waters began to recede, they did so with the same slowness with which they had risen. Noah sent out doves from time to time, waiting for the sign that the earth was habitable again. The first returned with nothing. The second brought an olive branch in its beak, and that small green sprout was like a cry of hope in the midst of desolation. Finally, the ark came to rest on dry land in the mountains of Ararat. Noah opened the door with trembling hands and stepped out into a completely transformed world. Everything he had known had disappeared. The cities, the roads, the cultivated fields, everything had been erased as a drawing in the sand is erased. But the earth was clean. The air smelled different, purer, as if creation itself had been washed. The animals came out in an orderly procession, dispersing towards the 4 cardinal points to repopulate an empty world. Noah built an altar with the first stones he found and offered sacrifice. It was not a gesture of negotiation, but of gratitude, the acknowledgement of one who has been preserved when everything else perished. And then the rainbow appeared. It stretched from horizon to horizon with colors that seemed more vivid than anything earthly. It was not just a meteorological phenomenon, it was a seal, a visible promise that never again would the waters cover the entire earth in that way. Noah gazed at the rainbow with tears in his eyes, understanding that this marked the beginning of a new era. The previous world, with its giants and its fallen angels, with its violence and its corruption, had ended. Now something new was beginning, fragile still, but with the possibility of being better. He knelt with his family, and together they watched as the rainbow shone against the clouds, a bridge of light between the past judgment and the future hope. Enoch no longer walked on earth. His feet did not touch any ground, because the place where he now found himself did not obey the laws of physics he had known. He was in a space that existed between dimensions, where the sky opened in infinite layers of glory. Uriel guided him through corridors of light, showing him the houses of the winds, the warehouses where hail and snow were stored, the secret places where lightning was born. Each revelation was overwhelming, each vision more extraordinary than the last, but nothing prepared him for what he saw when they arrived at the throne. It could not be described with human words because language itself fell short before that majesty. He could only capture flashes, fragments of glory that his mortal mind could barely process. And there, next to the throne, he saw a figure that Uriel called the Son of Man. He was not like the angels who shone with borrowed light. This figure radiated authority of his own, a presence that was both completely divine and strangely human. Enoch understood, without anyone explaining it to him, that he was contemplating something that had not yet fully manifested on earth, but that one day it would. He was a promise incarnate, the definitive answer to the problem of evil that he had seen unleashed in his time. The Son of Man looked at him, and in that look there was recognition, as if he knew every word that Enoch had written, every tear he had shed for suffering humanity. Enoch fell to his knees, not out of obligation, but out of the natural need to bow before something infinitely greater than himself. And in that moment, He understood why he had been taken, why he had not experienced death like other men. It was not only to preserve him from the flood, but so that he could bear witness to these celestial realities, so that he could write about what he had seen and transmit it to future generations. His mission as a scribe had not ended with the judgment of the Watchers. It had only just begun, because now he had to record not only the fall, but also the hope, not only the punishment, but also the promise of restoration. He took the celestial pen that Uriel gave him, a pen that wrote with light on scrolls that would never fade, and began to write again. Uriel departed from the throne and descended to an intermediate place where the future and the present met. He carried in his hands a sealed scroll, a document that contained dates and decrees that had not yet been fulfilled. He unrolled it solemnly, and his voice resonated in dimensions that humans could not perceive, but that spiritual beings heard clearly. He read the final sentence of the Watchers, not the one that had already been executed, but the one that would come at the end of time. He spoke of the great day of judgment, when all accounts would be settled definitively. On that day, Azazel and the others would be taken from their temporary prisons and thrown into the lake of fire prepared since the foundation of the world. There would be no more waiting, no more time to reflect. It would be the definitive closure of a story that had begun with an oath on Mount Hermon. But Uriel also read something more, something that brought a different nuance to the sentence. He spoke of how the work of the Watchers, although corrupt, would be finally redeemed. The knowledge that they had shared prematurely and selfishly would be purified and returned to humanity in the appropriate time. The arts that they had taught for destruction would be transformed into tools of construction. Even the pain caused by the Nephilim would be used to teach future generations about the dangers of crossing divine boundaries. Nothing would be wasted, not even the darkest evil, because the Creator had the capacity to weave even broken threads into a tapestry of redemption. Uriel rolled up the scroll and sealed it again. The story remained open, not closed, because although the judgment of the Watchers was definitive, the history of humanity continued, and in that continuation, there was space for hope, for renewal, for the possibility that even after the deepest fall, there could be a way back. The angel looked towards the earth where Noah and his family were beginning to rebuild, and then towards the abyss, where the Watchers awaited chained. And in his heart, which was capable of sustaining apparently contradictory truths, there was both justice and compassion, both firmness and longing that one day, somehow, all things would be restored. Before everything fell apart, before desire and rebellion forever marked the history of the Watchers, there existed a perfect order. The angels were not simple automatized servants, but beings with will, capable of choice, of thought, of experiencing something akin to what humans called emotions. But their emotions were different, purer, untainted by mortality or the fear of death. They lived in a dimension where time did not flow as it did on Earth, where a day could be like 1,000 years and 1,000 years like a day. Their existence was one of continuous adoration, joyful service, contemplation of the divine glory that filled them with a delight that no earthly pleasure could equal. The Watchers, in particular, had been created with a specific purpose: to observe and protect. Their very name revealed their function. They were the eyes of heaven upon the earth, the guardians of the boundaries between the divine and the human. They were not to interfere directly in human affairs, but simply to observe, report, and maintain the balance. This was a task that required a special quality: the ability to look without becoming emotionally involved, to care without possessing, to love from a distance without crossing the established boundaries. For eons, they fulfilled this function flawlessly. They saw humans born, grow, love, suffer, and die. And although they felt something akin to compassion, it never occurred to them that they could be part of that cycle. They were eternal observers of a play in which they were not destined to act. But prolonged observation has its dangers. When you look at something long enough, you begin to understand it in ways that go beyond intellectual knowledge. You begin to feel empathy, to imagine what it would be like to experience what you are observing. And for beings gifted with will and curiosity, that imagination can become desire. The Watchers began to notice things that had previously gone unnoticed. The way a mother cradled her child, the tenderness in the eyes of a husband looking at his wife, the shared laughter among friends around a fire. These were simple, everyday moments, but they contained something that heaven, with all its glory, did not offer. The intimacy that is born of shared vulnerability. In heaven, there was no vulnerability because there was no death or loss. And without vulnerability, intimacy was different, less intense, less human. Samjaza was one of the first to articulate this feeling, although at first he did so cautiously, almost with shame. He spoke with other watchers about the strange sense of emptiness he sometimes experienced, as if all the celestial glory was not enough to fill a space in his being that he didn't even know existed. Others admitted to feeling the same, and so began a dangerous conversation, one that questioned not the goodness of the Creator, but the purpose of their own existence. Why had they been created with the ability to observe and understand human love if they could never experience it? Was it a test, a design flaw, or perhaps a veiled invitation to explore possibilities that had not yet been explicitly authorized? These questions circulated among the watchers like a silent virus, slowly infecting their original contentment. And Azazel, ever the boldest, the most willing to push the boundaries, began to suggest a revolutionary idea. What if they were not destined to remain forever as observers, and if their capacity to understand and desire human experience was actually a sign that they should evolve, transcend their original function? Azazel argued that the Creator had given them free will precisely so that they could choose their own path, not so that they blindly followed a pre-established script. It was a seductive logic because it contained enough truth to seem reasonable. Yes, they had free will, yes, they could choose. But what Azazel did not mention, or perhaps did not fully understand, was that free will does not mean the absence of consequences. Every choice has a price, and the greater the being who chooses, the greater the impact of their choice. A human who chooses poorly affects primarily their own life and perhaps that of their family. But an angel who chooses poorly can alter the course of all creation. And that was precisely what was about to happen. The Book of Enoch. For centuries it was considered sacred scripture by early Jewish and Christian communities, cited by the Church Fathers, referenced in the New Testament, and preserved with reverence by traditions that understood its value. However, over time, it was relegated to the category of apocryphal by most Western Christian denominations, although the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains it as canonical to this day. Why was such an influential text eventually excluded from the canon? And more importantly, what does it tell us about the way early faith communities understood the nature of evil, the angelic fall, and the divine plan of redemption? To answer these questions, we must first understand what the Book of Enoch is exactly. It is not a single book, but a collection of 5 distinct sections written probably between the 3rd century BC and the 1st century AD. The first section, known as the Book of the Watchers, is the one that narrates the story we have been exploring. The fall of the angels, their union with human women, the birth of the Nephilim, and the subsequent divine judgment. This section is the oldest and probably the most influential. The second section, the Book of Parables, contains apocalyptic visions and is where the title Son of Man appears most frequently, an expression that Jesus would use centuries later to refer to himself. The third section, the astronomical book, details the workings of the heavens, the movements of the sun and moon, and the sacred calendar. The fourth, the Book of Dreams, includes allegorical visions of the history of Israel represented through animals. And the fifth, the Epistle of Enoch, contains ethical exhortations and warnings about the coming judgment. The influence of this text on Second Temple Judaism was immense. Manuscripts found in Qumran, among the Dead Sea Scrolls, include multiple copies of the Book of Enoch, indicating that the Essene community considered it of great importance. Enochian ideas about angels, demons, the origin of evil, and eschatology permeated Jewish thought of the time, influencing texts such as the Book of Jubilees and the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs. When we come to the New Testament, we find clear echoes of the Book of Enoch. The letter of Jude explicitly quotes a prophecy of Enoch, and the second letter of Peter refers to angels who sinned and were cast into Tartarus, a clear allusion to the Enochian narrative. The Revelation of John contains images and symbolism that have striking parallels with the visions of Enoch. Even the Gospels, when they speak of demons, of Satan as the prince of this world, or of the final judgment, are operating within a conceptual framework that was significantly shaped by Enochian literature. The early church fathers, such as Tertullian, Origen, and Clement of Alexandria, cited the Book of Enoch, considering it a legitimate source of knowledge about the spiritual world. Tertullian even defended it as inspired scripture, arguing that if Jude quoted it in his canonical epistle, then it should be considered authoritative. However, doubts arose over time. St. Augustine expressed reservations about its authenticity, arguing that such an ancient book could hardly have been preserved through the flood. St. Jerome, when compiling the Latin Vulgate, decided not to include it in the canon, and gradually the Book of Enoch disappeared from Western Christian consciousness, preserved only in Ethiopia, where it continued to be read and venerated. Why was it excluded? The reasons are multiple and complex. First, there were doubts about its authorship. Although attributed to Enoch, the seventh from Adam, it was evident that it had been written much later. Second, some of its theological details seemed speculative, going beyond what the canonical biblical revelation affirmed. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the Church was in the process of defining its canon, and there was a tendency to be conservative, including only those texts whose authority was universally recognized. But the rejection of the Book of Enoch as canonical did not eliminate its influence. The ideas it contained had already deeply permeated Christian thought. The notion of a primordial angelic rebellion, the existence of demons as fallen angels, the idea of an eschatological judgment where all accounts would be settled, all this has its roots in the Enochian tradition. When Dante wrote the Divine Comedy, when Milton composed Paradise Lost, they were drinking from a well that the Book of Enoch had helped to dig. Today, with the distance of centuries, we can appreciate the Book of Enoch as a fascinating testament to how Jewish communities of the Second Temple period struggled to understand the problem of evil, the role of spiritual beings, and the divine plan of redemption. The word Nephilim appears in the Bible only twice explicitly, in Genesis 6 verse 4 and in Numbers 13:33. But those two brief mentions have generated centuries of debate, speculation, and fascination. Who exactly were these beings? Were they literally giants of colossal proportions? Or should the term be understood more symbolically? And what does their existence tell us about the nature of spiritual reality and its intersection with the material world? The Hebrew term Nephilim comes from the root nephil, which means to fall. Some scholars translate it as the fallen ones, referring to their origin as descendants of fallen angels. Others prefer those who caused to fall, suggesting that they were fearsome warriors who brought down their enemies. And there are those who argue that it simply means giants, based on the usage of the Greek Septuagint, which translates the term as gigantes. Whatever the precise etymology, the biblical text is clear on one point. These beings were the result of the union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, and they were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Book of Enoch dramatically expands on this terse narrative. According to this text, the Nephilim were not simply large in stature, but monsters measuring 300 cubits according to some versions, which would be equivalent to more than 450 feet in height. Obviously, this figure should be understood as hyperbolic, a way of communicating not so much a literal measurement, but the aberrant and unnatural nature of these beings. The important thing was not exactly how tall they were, but what they represented. A violation of the created order, a mixture of the celestial and the terrestrial that should never have occurred. Enoch describes the Nephilim as beings of insatiable appetite. They began by consuming all the product of human labor, devouring entire crops and herds. When this was no longer enough, they turned against the humans themselves, and finally, in their desperate hunger, they began to devour one another. This progression is not accidental. It represents a downward spiral of corruption, where each transgression leads to a greater one. The Nephilim are also described as violent and oppressive, teaching humanity the arts of war and domination. They were, in essence, the personification of chaos, the antithesis of the divine order. But is there any historical basis for these narratives? Curiously, almost all ancient cultures have legends of giants. The Greeks spoke of the Titans and the giants who fought against the Olympian gods. The Norse had the Jotun, primordial giants in constant conflict with the Aesir. Mesopotamian traditions mention hybrid beings such as the Apkallu, semi-divine sages who taught civilization to humanity. Native Americans have numerous legends about races of giants who inhabited the earth before them. Are all these narratives distorted echoes of a real historical event? Or are they simply universal expressions of human fears and fantasies? From an archaeological perspective, there is no conclusive evidence of a race of literal giants. The largest human skeletons found belong to individuals with conditions such as gigantism or acromegaly, but nothing that comes close to the proportions described in ancient texts. However, this does not necessarily mean that the narratives are pure fiction. It is possible that the giants were exceptionally tall or strong individuals who, in an era where average height was lower, seemed truly colossal. It is also possible that the term giant refers not so much to physical size, but to power and influence. In many ancient cultures, powerful rulers and warriors were described in hyperbolic terms, as if they were more than human. The Nephilim could have been a caste of tyrannical warriors or rulers whose cruelty and power made them legendary. From a theological perspective, the Nephilim represent something deeper than a simple historical fact. They are a symbol of what happens when the boundaries established by the Creator are violated. Their very existence was an abomination, not because they were inherently evil, but because their origin was the result of a cosmic transgression. They could not exist within the created order without corrupting it, and that is why they had to be eliminated. The flood, in this context, was not simply a punishment for human wickedness, but a cosmic necessity. The earth had been so corrupted by the presence of the Nephilim that it needed to be completely purified. It was like a field infested with weeds to the point where the only solution is to burn everything and start again. Interestingly, Numbers 13:33 mentions that the Israelite spies saw Nephilim in Canaan, specifically identifying them as descendants of Enoch. This raises a complicated theological question. If the Nephilim were destroyed in the flood, how could they exist afterward? Some traditions suggest that there was a second incursion of fallen angels after the flood, although on a smaller scale. Others propose that certain human lineages carried corrupted genetics that occasionally produced individuals of exceptional stature. And others argue that the term Nephilim in Numbers is used more generally to refer to any person of great stature, not necessarily to direct descendants of fallen angels. Among all the watchers who fell, Azazel occupies a special place in the Enochian narrative. He was not the leader of the group; that role belonged to Samjaza, but in many ways he was the most influential and the most dangerous. While Samjaza fell for love, or at least for a desire for emotional connection, Azazel fell for something different: intellectual pride and the desire to be worshipped as a giver of knowledge. Azazel was the master, the instructor, the one who was not content with simply experiencing human life, but wanted to transform it, elevate it, and in the process irrevocably corrupt it. The Book of Enoch attributes to him the teaching of specific arts that radically changed human society. He taught metallurgy, showing men how to extract minerals from the earth and forge them into weapons: swords, knives, shields, and armor. Before Azazel, human conflicts were resolved with stones and sticks, primitive violence but limited in its scope. After his teachings, war became systematic, efficient, lethal on an unprecedented scale. He also taught the art of cosmetics and jewelry, showing women how to enhance their beauty with antimony for the eyes, dyes to beautify the face, and precious stones to adorn the body. At first glance, this seems innocuous, even beneficial. What's wrong with wanting to look good? But the text suggests that these teachings awakened vanity, envy, and lust. Beauty ceased to be a natural gift and became a tool of manipulation and competition. Ornaments became status symbols that divided society between those who had and those who did not. What Azazel offered was not simply technical knowledge, but a transformation of values. He was teaching humanity to value power, appearance, and domination above virtue, community, and humility. And he did so with the conviction that he was liberating humanity from ignorance, elevating it to a higher level. He was, in his own mind, a benefactor, a Prometheus who stole the fire of the gods to give it to mortals. But like Prometheus, he did not understand that some knowledge comes with a price that humanity is not prepared to pay. The name Azazel itself is the subject of etymological debate. Some derive it from two Hebrew words, Azaz, strong, and El, God, suggesting God is strong, or the strong one of God. Others connect it with Ezozel, which means goat that departs or goat of removal, linking it directly with the ritual of the Day of Atonement described in Leviticus 16. In that ritual, the high priest took 2 goats. One was sacrificed as an offering for sin, and the other, the scapegoat, was sent into the desert for Azazel, symbolically carrying away the sins of the people. This connection is not accidental. In later Jewish tradition, Azazel came to be understood not as a place, but as a demonic being who inhabited the desert, the appropriate recipient of the sins that had to be removed from the community. The ritual of the scapegoat, then, was not simply symbolic but had a real spiritual dimension. Sins were returned to their original source, to the one who had taught humanity to sin in the first place. When Raphael receives the order to chain Azazel and throw him into Dudiel, there is a poetic symmetry at play. Azazel, who had taught humans to cover and adorn their bodies, is now covered with rough stones in the darkness. He who had revealed secrets is now buried where no secrets can be shared. He who had sought fame and recognition is now confined to absolute anonymity. And he who had corrupted the earth with his teachings is now removed from it, exactly as the scapegoat was removed from the community. But the sentence of Azazel does not end with his imprisonment in Dudiel. The Enochian text makes it clear that this is only temporary, a preventative detention until the final judgment. On the great day, he will be cast into the eternal fire, and all the earth will be healed of the corruption that he introduced. This promise of healing is crucial. It is not enough to remove the corrupter. The corruption itself must be undone. The teachings of Azazel had left an indelible mark on humanity. Knowledge, once given, cannot be simply forgotten, but it can be purified, recontextualized, redeemed. And that is precisely what the narrative promises. A day when even the arts taught by Azazel will be cleansed of their corrupt intent and used for holy purposes. The figure of Azazel confronts us with uncomfortable questions about the nature of knowledge and progress. Is all knowledge good? Or are there knowledges that humanity should not possess, at least not without the moral maturity to use them appropriately? In our era of accelerated technological advances, where we can edit genes, create artificial intelligence, and develop weapons of mass destruction, the story of Azazel resonates with a disturbing relevance. He represents the perennial temptation to seek power and knowledge without considering the ethical consequences, to value technical capacity above moral wisdom. And his destiny reminds us that such a path, however promising it may seem at first, inevitably leads to destruction. While Azazel represents intellectual pride and corruption through knowledge, Semjaza embodies something different, and perhaps more tragic: the fall for love, or at least for what he believed was love. His story is that of a being who exchanged eternity for a moment, who sacrificed celestial glory for earthly intimacy, and who discovered too late that some boundaries exist for reasons that transcend mere arbitrary prohibition. The name Semjaza appears in various forms in the ancient manuscripts: Shemahaza, Semiasa, Semayaza, each variation suggesting slightly different nuances. The most accepted etymology derives it from the Hebrew Shem, name, and Haza, to see, resulting in something like the name sees or the one whose name is seen. There is a profound irony in this name, because Semjaza sought to be seen, to be known, to be part of a story instead of simply observing it from the outside. And he certainly managed to be seen and remembered, but not in the way he had imagined. According to the Book of Enoch, Semjaza was the leader of the Watchers, the first among equals. It was he who articulated the desire that they all felt but that none dared to express. And it was he who, aware of the risk, proposed the binding oath on Mount Hermon. This detail is crucial to understanding his character. Semjaza was not a rebel. Semjaza was not impulsive, acting without thinking. On the contrary, he was cautious, almost prudent in his transgression. He knew exactly what he was doing and the potential consequences. That's why he insisted on the collective oath. If they all fell together, none could be singled out as the sole culprit, and perhaps, just perhaps, there would be strength in numbers to resist divine punishment. It was a cold calculation wrapped in hot passion, a dangerous mix that would characterize his entire story. When he finally descended and united with a human woman, the text doesn't describe violence or coercion. The Enochian tradition suggests there was mutual consent, even genuine affection. Semjaza didn't take by force. He seduced, courted, promised. And therein lies part of the tragedy. He truly believed what he felt was love. He didn't understand that true love doesn't destroy the beloved. It doesn't place them in an impossible position. It doesn't use them as a means to satisfy one's own existential void. True love seeks the good of the other, even when that good requires personal sacrifice. But Semjaza sought his own good, his own satisfaction, his own need for connection, and he called that love. The consequences of his choice were catastrophic. His union with a human woman produced the Nephilim giants who would devastate the earth. The teachings that he and other watchers shared would corrupt human society. And the woman he loved, if he truly loved her, was forever scarred. Mother of monsters, witness to horrors no human being should ever witness. Some texts suggest she died in childbirth, her fragile body unable to bear what she was bringing into the world. Others hint that she survived only to see her son become a devourer of men. In any case, Semjaza's love brought her not happiness, but destruction. When the moment of judgment arrives and Semjaza is called to present his defense, we see the depth of his self-deception. He speaks of love, of compassion, of a desire for connection. He tries to justify his actions as motivated by noble feelings, but as he speaks, the words sound hollow even to him, because deep down he knows the truth. It wasn't love that motivated him, but selfishness disguised as love. It was the desire to fill his own void, to experience something that was forbidden to him, to be something more than an eternal observer. And in that desire, however understandable it might have been, there was a seed of rebellion that germinated into catastrophe. Semjaza's sentence is particularly cruel in its precision. He isn't simply thrown into a dark prison like Azazel. Instead, he is forced to witness the destruction of everything his transgression produced. He sees the Nephilim, his children, die in fratricidal wars. He watches the flood cover the earth, erasing all evidence that his love ever existed. He sees the woman he loved disappear beneath the waters along with everything else. And only after witnessing all of this, only after the full weight of his consequences has been indelibly etched into his consciousness, is he chained in the depths of the earth to await final judgment. It is a punishment designed not only to punish but to teach, to ensure that he understands exactly why what he did was wrong. In many ways, Semjaza is the most tragic character in the entire narrative. Azazel fell through pride, a sin that is easy to condemn. But Semjaza fell through a desire for connection, through a longing for intimacy, for feelings that in themselves are not evil. The problem wasn't what he felt, but how he responded to those feelings. He crossed boundaries that existed not to arbitrarily deprive him, but to protect the order of creation. And in crossing them, he unleashed consequences that not even his angelic mind could have fully foreseen. His story is a warning about the nature of true love versus selfish desire disguised as love, about the importance of boundaries, even when they seem restrictive, and about how the best intentions can lead to the worst results when one acts outside the established order. Enoch, a figure of immense significance and mystery, stands in stark contrast to the fallen watchers. While other patriarchs lived for centuries and then died, Genesis 5 verse 24 says of Enoch with a mysterious brevity, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." No tomb, no funeral lament, no process of death. One day he was there, and the next he was gone. This enigmatic disappearance turned him into a figure of immense speculation and reverence in later Jewish and Christian traditions. But who was Enoch really? The biblical text gives us few details. We know he was the seventh from Adam, son of Jared, father of Methuselah. He lived 365 years, a number significantly less than other antediluvian patriarchs, but symbolically important because it corresponds to the number of days in the solar year. We know he walked with God, a phrase that in Hebrew suggests intimacy, constant communion, a relationship of unusual closeness. And we know that God took him, an expression that implies not death but translation, a movement from one state of existence to another. The Book of Enoch dramatically expands this terse narrative, transforming Enoch from a genealogical footnote into the protagonist of a cosmic epic. According to this text, Enoch was someone who had learned the art of recording, of preserving knowledge through writing. In an age where most of humanity was illiterate, where knowledge was transmitted orally and easily lost, the ability to write was almost magical. A scribe could capture words and make them permanent. He could speak to future generations. He could preserve truths that would otherwise fade like mist at dawn. This skill was not accidental. It was precisely what qualified him for the role he would play in the cosmic drama that was unfolding. Enoch lived in an age of increasing violence and corruption. He saw society crumble, the Nephilim terrorize the population. The teachings of the fallen watchers transform human culture in deeply destructive ways. And amidst all this, he wrote, recorded genealogies, preserved stories, documented what he saw. He wasn't a warrior who could fight the giants. He wasn't a king who could change laws. He wasn't a charismatic prophet who could move masses. He was simply a scribe, someone whose power resided in the pen, not the sword. But it turned out that that was exactly what was needed. When the cry of the earth reached heaven, when the archangels deliberated on how to respond to the crisis, they needed an intermediary, someone who could speak the language of heaven and earth, someone who could present the case of suffering humanity before the celestial court, someone who could record divine decrees and transmit them to future generations. Enoch, with his pen and his compassionate heart, was the perfect candidate. Uriel called him, and Enoch ascended. This is remarkable. When Moses was called, he argued and made excuses. When Jeremiah was called, he protested that he was too young. When Jonah was called, he fled in the opposite direction. But Enoch, when asked to ascend to heaven and speak before beings of unimaginable glory, simply said yes, not because he was particularly brave or confident, but because he had cultivated for years a relationship of trust with God. He had walked with God in the ordinary. So when the extraordinary arrived, the transition was natural. The visions that Enoch experienced during his celestial ascension are some of the most vivid and strange in all of apocalyptic literature. He saw the chambers of the winds, the storehouses of snow and hail, the places where thunder and lightning are generated. He saw the gates of heaven through which the sun and moon emerge. He saw the places of punishment prepared for the rebel angels and for evil humans. He saw the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. And finally, he saw the throne of God surrounded by myriads of angels, with the Son of Man seated in glory. These visions were not celestial entertainment or spiritual tourism. Each had a purpose, to expand Enoch's understanding of the structure of the cosmos, about how the visible and invisible are intertwined, about how judgment and mercy operate on scales that transcend ordinary human experience. He was being educated, prepared for his role as witness and recorder of cosmic truths. When he returned to Earth, albeit briefly before his final translation, Enoch was no longer the same. He had seen too much, he knew too much, he had been transformed too deeply. His farewell to his family is one of the most moving moments in the entire narrative. He gives them the scrolls he has written. He makes them promise to preserve them. He assures them that even though he is leaving, he isn't abandoning them. And then he walks towards the horizon, his body becoming increasingly luminous until it simply vanishes. Later Jewish tradition would further develop the figure of Enoch, identifying him with the angel Metatron, the celestial scribe who records all human actions. According to these traditions, Enoch was so transformed by his celestial experience that he ceased to be human in the ordinary sense and became something new, a permanent bridge between the human and the divine. The flood was not simply a large inundation. It was not a natural disaster that coincidentally coincided with a period of human wickedness. It was, according to the biblical and Enochian narratives, a deliberate divine intervention, a cosmic purification, a reset of creation that had been corrupted beyond repair. To truly understand the flood, we must first understand the degree of corruption that preceded it. It wasn't just that humans were violent or immoral in the ordinary sense. The earth had been contaminated at an ontological level in its very essence. The presence of the Nephilim, beings that should never have existed, had introduced an anomaly into the created order. The teachings of the Watchers had twisted the natural development of human civilization. Violence had reached levels that made community life impossible. And according to Genesis 6 verse 12, all flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. This last phrase is significant. It doesn't say just that humans were evil, but that all flesh had been corrupted. Some interpreters understand this as referring to the animals as well, suggesting that even the animal kingdom had been affected by the corruption introduced by the Watchers. It was as if a spiritual virus had infected the entire biosphere, and the only cure was a radical cleansing. The flood then wasn't a capricious punishment from a temperamental god, but a therapeutic necessity. It was like a surgeon who must amputate a gangrenous limb to save the body, or like a farmer who must burn a completely infested field to be able to replant. Painful, yes, traumatic, without a doubt, but necessary if there was to be any future. The choice of Noah as the one to be preserved was not arbitrary. Genesis 6 verse 9 says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generations. Noah walked with God. The phrase blameless in his generations has been the subject of much debate. Some understand it morally. Noah was upright in his character. Others understand it genetically. Noah's lineage hadn't been contaminated by mixing with the Nephilim. Probably both senses are present. Noah was righteous in character and pure in lineage, which made him the ideal candidate to be the new Adam, the father of a renewed humanity. The construction of the ark is itself a fascinating story. The dimensions given in Genesis 6 verse 15 describe a massive structure, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high. This equates to approximately 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. It wasn't a ship in the modern sense, designed to navigate, but rather a giant floating box designed simply to stay afloat and protect its contents. Modern calculations have shown that a structure of these dimensions would have excellent stability, even in turbulent waters, and sufficient capacity to house representatives of all the animal species known in the ancient Near East. But beyond the technical details, the ark functioned as a powerful symbol. It was a microcosm of the original world, a floating Garden of Eden where humans and animals coexisted in peace. It was a time capsule that preserved not only biological life, but also knowledge, culture, and memory. And it was a visible testament to faith, because Noah built it for decades while his neighbors mocked, believing in a promise of judgment that had not yet materialized. When the rain finally began, the text describes a phenomenon of cataclysmic proportions. It wasn't just that it rained from above, but that all the fountains of the great deep burst forth. This suggests massive geological activity, with water gushing from the depths of the earth. It was as if the planet itself was unraveling, returning to the primordial state described in Genesis 1 verse 2. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. The flood was, in a sense, a decreation, a return to the original aquatic chaos, setting the stage for a new creation. The water rose for 40 days and 40 nights, a symbolic number that appears repeatedly in Scripture as a period of testing and transformation. It covered the highest mountains by 15 cubits, ensuring that nothing that breathed air could survive. And then it remained covering the earth for 150 days before beginning to recede. This long period of immersion was not only to ensure the death of everything corrupt, but also to allow the earth itself to be cleansed, saturated with water that washed away the spiritual contamination that had infected it. Inside the ark, Noah and his family were experiencing something unique in human history, a time outside of time, suspended between the world that had been and the world that would be. They couldn't do anything except wait, trust, care for the animals that shared their refuge. It was a period of gestation, of silent preparation for the birth of a new world. When the waters finally receded and the door of the ark opened, what Noah saw was simultaneously desolate and hopeful. Desolate because everything familiar had disappeared. Every trace of the previous civilization had been erased. Hopeful because the earth was clean, ready for a new beginning, free of the corruption that had plagued it. In the cosmic drama of the fall of the Watchers, four angelic figures emerge from the celestial side: Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, and Uriel. Each plays a specific role in the divine response to the crisis, and each represents different aspects of how celestial justice operates. They aren't simply passive messengers who transmit orders. They are active agents who execute judgment with surgical precision, each according to their specific nature and function. Michael, whose name means "who is like God," is presented as the warrior, the prince of the heavenly hosts. In Jewish and Christian tradition, Michael is the defender of Israel, the one who fights against the forces of evil, the one who in Revelation casts the dragon out of heaven. In the Enochian narrative, his role is to oversee the execution of judgment, to ensure that divine decrees are fulfilled with precision. There is no cruelty in Michael, but neither is there sentimentality. He understands that mercy without justice is indulgence, and that allowing evil to continue unchecked is itself a form of cruelty towards the innocent. When he is ordered to bind the Watchers and destroy the Nephilim, he does so without hesitation, not because he enjoys violence, but because he understands the necessity. He is like a surgeon who must cut away diseased tissue. The action is painful but necessary for the health of the whole organism. Gabriel, whose name means "strength of God" or "God is my strength," is the messenger par excellence. He appears repeatedly in Scripture as the one who brings important announcements to Daniel about the 70 weeks, to Zechariah about the birth of John the Baptist, to Mary about the conception of Jesus. In the Enochian context, Gabriel is sent to announce to Noah what is coming, to instruct him in the construction of the ark, to prepare him for his role as the preserver of humanity. There is a tenderness in Gabriel that contrasts with the firmness of Michael. He understands human fear, the confusion, the need for explanation and comfort. When he speaks to Noah, he not only transmits technical information about dimensions and materials, he also offers hope, the promise that even though the known world will end, there will be a future, an opportunity to start again. Gabriel is the compassionate face of judgment, the one who ensures that even in the midst of destruction, mercy has the last word. Raphael, whose name means "God heals," receives perhaps the most symbolically significant task, to chain Azazel and throw him into Dudiel. Raphael is known in Jewish tradition as the angel of healing, the one who restores what has been broken. In the Book of Tobit, deuterocanonical for Catholics and Orthodox Christians, Raphael guides the young Tobit and heals his father's blindness. Why, then, is he assigned a seemingly violent task such as the imprisonment of Azazel? Because the imprisonment of Azazel is itself an act of healing. Azazel had been the source of contamination, the one who had taught arts that corrupted humanity. Removing him was like extracting a cancerous tumor, painful at the moment, but necessary for recovery. And the Enochian text is explicit. After Azazel is removed, all the earth will be healed. Raphael not only punishes the guilty, he prepares the way for the restoration of the victim. It is restorative justice in its purest form. Uriel, whose name means "light of God" or "fire of God, is perhaps the most mysterious of the four. In some traditions he is considered the angel of wisdom, the one who illuminates the human mind with divine knowledge. In the Enochian narrative, Uriel has a special relationship with Enoch. He is the one who calls him, who guides him in his celestial ascension, who shows him the visions of the heavens and of the places of judgment. Uriel functions as a teacher and a revealer, the one who helps Enoch understand not only what is happening, but why. It is not enough to know that there will be judgment. It is necessary to understand the logic behind the judgment, the justice that sustains it, the redemptive purpose that guides it. Uriel is the one who ensures that knowledge is not lost, that the lessons of this era are preserved for future generations. Together, these four archangels represent a holistic response to the problem of evil. Michael brings the force necessary to confront and overcome. Gabriel brings the communication and comfort necessary to prepare and preserve. Raphael brings the healing necessary to restore what has been damaged. And Uriel brings the illumination necessary to understand and learn. They don't act independently, but in perfect coordination, each complementing the others, each essential to the success of the mission. It is important to note that at no point do these archangels act on their own initiative. They don't decide for themselves that the Watchers must be punished or that the earth must be purified. They hear the cry of the earth, they present it before the divine throne, and then they execute the decrees that they receive. They are agents, not authors, of judgment. This is crucial for the theology that underlies the narrative. Judgment is not the result of vengeful angels taking justice into their own hands, but the measured and deliberate response of the Creator to a situation that has reached a critical point. The archangels are the hands through which divine justice operates, but the will that guides them is that of the Most High. The story of the Watchers is not just an ancient tale of rebel angels and mythological giants. It is a mirror that reflects eternal truths about human nature, about the consequences of choices, about the boundaries that exist for reasons deeper than mere prohibition. When we look at this narrative with contemporary eyes, we discover that it speaks directly to the challenges we face in our own time, offering wisdom that transcends the millennia that separate us from its origin. The first lesson is about limits and boundaries. The Watchers were created with a specific purpose, to observe and protect, but not to interfere. That boundary was not arbitrary. It wasn't the caprice of a controlling God. It wasn't that God was simply trying to keep his servants in small boxes. Rather, this structure was necessary to maintain the equilibrium of creation itself. When the Watchers crossed that boundary, they weren't merely disobeying a rule. They were destabilizing the very fabric of reality. In our time, we live in a culture that frequently views limits as oppressive, as obstacles to self-actualization and personal freedom. We are encouraged to follow our hearts, to live our truth, to break barriers. And certainly, there are limits that are oppressive social constructs that exist only to maintain unjust power structures. But the story of the Watchers reminds us that not all limits are like that. Some exist to protect us from consequences that our limited wisdom cannot foresee. True freedom does not consist in the total absence of boundaries, but in understanding which boundaries are protective and which are restrictive, and having the wisdom to distinguish between the two. It's like navigating a dense forest. The path may feel restrictive, but it keeps you from falling into a ravine you couldn't see. The second lesson is about knowledge and power. Azazel believed that he was elevating humanity by sharing forbidden knowledge, and in a sense, he was right. Metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, all these arts had the potential to improve human life. The problem wasn't the knowledge itself, but the timing and the motivation. Humanity was not morally prepared to handle certain types of power. Giving them sophisticated weapons before they had developed the wisdom to use them responsibly was like giving a sharp knife to a toddler. In our era of exponential technological advancements, this lesson resonates with particular urgency. We have the capacity to edit genomes, create artificial intelligence, develop weapons of mass destruction, manipulate public opinion through sophisticated algorithms. We stand at the precipice of wielding powers that were once the domain of gods. But our moral wisdom has not grown at the same pace as our technical capability. We are like the antediluvian humans, powerful but not necessarily wise, capable but not necessarily responsible. The story of Azazel warns us that knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility, capability without ethics, inevitably leads to destruction. It's the age-old tale of Icarus, who flew too close to the sun with wings of wax and feathers. The third lesson is about love and selfishness. Semjaza believed that he was acting out of love, that his desire for connection with a human woman was noble and pure. He painted his desires as a grand romance, a testament to the unifying power of affection. But true love seeks the good of the beloved, even when that requires personal sacrifice. What Semjaza called love was actually selfish desire, disguised as genuine affection. He wanted to fill his own void, satisfy his own need, experience something that was forbidden, and he called that love. The consequences were catastrophic, not only for him, but especially for the woman he claimed to love and for the children who were born of that union. How many times do we do the same? How many times do we pursue relationships that we know are destructive, justifying them with the language of love? How many times do we cross boundaries that we know we shouldn't cross, telling ourselves that love justifies everything? The story of Semjaza teaches us that true love respects limits, considers consequences, seeks the good of the other, even when that means relinquishing one's own desire. Love, in its purest form, is not a feeling but a commitment, a choice to prioritize the well-being of another. The fourth lesson deals with justice and mercy. The judgment upon the Watchers was severe and definitive. There was no second chance, no rehabilitation program, no forgiveness. This may seem harsh, especially to modern sensibilities that value redemption and restoration. We live in an age of restorative justice, where the focus is on healing and reintegration. But the narrative makes it clear that the Watchers were not ignorant. They knew perfectly well the laws they were breaking and the consequences of their actions. Their transgression was not the result of confusion or momentary weakness, but of deliberate and sustained choice. And the consequences of their actions were so massive, affecting all of creation, that justice demanded a proportional response. To forgive without accountability would have undermined the very foundations of cosmic order. However, even within that severe judgment, there was mercy. Noah was preserved. Humanity received a second chance. The earth was cleansed and renewed. The judgment was not the end of the story, but the means by which a new story could begin. This teaches us that justice and mercy are not opposites, but necessary partners. Mercy without justice is indulgence, which allows evil to continue unchecked. Justice without mercy is cruelty, which offers no hope of restoration. Both are necessary for a world that functions properly. They are two sides of the same coin, reflecting the complex nature of divine governance. The fifth, and perhaps most profound lesson, is about redemption and hope. The story of the Watchers is tragic, but it is not the whole story. The Book of Enoch, especially in its later sections, points beyond judgment toward a time when all things will be restored, when even deep evil will be redeemed and transformed. It's a whisper of hope amidst the darkness, a promise that even the most broken of creations can find their way back to grace. This does not mean that the Watchers will be forgiven or that their actions will be forgotten, but it means that the Creator has the capacity to weave even the darkest threads into a tapestry of beauty and meaning. The divine artist can take even the most corrupted of colors and blend them into a masterpiece of cosmic proportions. When the Nephilim perished, whether devoured by each other during the wars of hunger or drowned beneath the waters of the flood, their physical story ended. But, according to various early Jewish and Christian traditions, their spiritual story had only just begun. The Book of Enoch suggests that when the giants died, their spirits did not follow the normal path of human souls. They did not descend to Sheol to await final judgment, nor did they ascend to any place of rest. Instead, they were trapped in an intermediate state, becoming what later tradition would call demons or unclean spirits. They became the restless, tormented entities that haunt the fringes of reality. This idea may seem strange at first, but it has a coherent internal logic. The Nephilim were hybrids, a mixture of the celestial and the terrestrial, beings that never should have existed within the created order. Their very nature was an ontological anomaly. They were a disruption in the divine plan, a cosmic glitch in the matrix. When their physical bodies died, their spirits had no appropriate place to go. They were too terrestrial for heaven, too celestial for the human underworld. So, they remained on earth, disembodied but conscious, hungry for physical experience but unable to satisfy that hunger directly. They became the spiritual vagrants, forever seeking a home they could never truly find. According to this interpretation, these disincarnate spirits of the Nephilim became the demons that torment humanity in the narratives of the New Testament. They are the unclean spirits that Jesus casts out, that beg not to be sent to the abyss, that desperately seek to inhabit bodies, whether human or even animal, like the swine of Gadara. They are driven by a primal need to anchor themselves to the physical world. Their behavior reflects their hybrid nature and their unnatural state. They yearn for the incarnation they lost, seeking to experience the physical world through others. They cause disease and unrest because their own existence is a form of cosmic disease. They are the living embodiment of chaos, forever seeking to disrupt the harmony of creation. This tradition explains several disconcerting aspects of biblical demonology. First, it explains why demons seem so desperate to possess human bodies. It is not simply malice. It is existential necessity. They are spirits that once had physical form and yearn to regain it in any way possible. They see human bodies as vessels, as temporary means of escaping their disembodied state. Second, it explains the distinction between demons and fallen angels. The watchers who fell were chained in places of torment, awaiting final judgment. But the demons, being the spirits of the Nephilim, remain free to roam the earth, though their freedom is itself a form of torment. They are the foot soldiers in the cosmic war, carrying out the will of their fallen brethren. Third, it explains why demons seem particularly interested in corrupting and destroying humanity. They carry within their very essence the resentment of beings who never should have existed, who were the product of a cosmic transgression, who lost their bodies in a violent and traumatic way. They see humanity as a reminder of their own failed existence, and they seek to drag them down into the same abyss of despair. The Book of Jubilees, another ancient Jewish text, develops this idea even further. According to this text, after the flood, when Noah and his sons began to repopulate the earth, the spirits of the Nephilim began to attack their descendants, causing disease, temptation, and destruction. Noah prayed that these spirits would be bound, and his prayer was heard. Mastema, identified as the prince of demons, asked permission to retain 1/10 of these spirits under his command, arguing that he needed agents to test and tempt humanity. The permission was granted, and so 9/10 of the spirits of the Nephilim were bound, while 1/10 remained free to operate under the direction of Mastema. They became the architects of human suffering, whispering doubts and fears into the hearts of men. This narrative is fascinating because it introduces several important theological concepts. First, it establishes that the demonic power in the post-Diluvian world is only a fraction of what it was in the antediluvian era. The majority of the evil spirits are bound, and only a remnant operates actively. This is why, although evil continues to exist after the flood, it does not reach the catastrophic levels that preceded the inundation. The flood served as a cosmic purge, a cleansing of the earth from the overwhelming influence of demonic forces. Second, it introduces the idea that even the demons who remain free operate under divine restrictions. They do not have absolute freedom. They function within established parameters, with limited permission. They are like dogs on a leash, able to bark and snap but ultimately controlled by a higher power. Third, it suggests that the continued existence of temptation and testing in the world has a pedagogical purpose. Humans need the opportunity to choose between good and evil to develop genuine moral character. Without the presence of darkness, there can be no true appreciation for the light. In the New Testament, we find echoes of these traditions. Jesus speaks of Satan falling from heaven like lightning, suggesting a violent expulsion. Paul speaks of principalities and powers, of rulers of the darkness of this world, of spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places. Peter and Jude mention angels who sinned and were cast down to Tartarus, chained in darkness until judgment. And the Apocalypse speaks of a war in heaven, with the dragon and his angels being cast down to the earth. All these references suggest a complex cosmology, where multiple categories of evil spiritual beings operate at different levels and with different degrees of freedom. Some, like the original Watchers, are completely bound. Others, like the spirits of the Nephilim, roam the earth seeking whom they may devour. And others, like Satan himself, retain considerable power and freedom, though always under the ultimate sovereignty of the Creator. They are all players in the grand cosmic drama, each with their own role to play in the unfolding of human history. For the early Christians, this understanding of spiritual reality was not abstract or academic. They lived in a world where demonic possession was an everyday reality, where illness and madness were often attributed to evil spiritual influence, where the battle against principalities and powers was as real as any physical conflict. They saw the world as a battleground between the forces of good and evil, where human souls were the prize. The ministry of liberation of Jesus, casting out demons and healing the oppressed, was not a spectacle, but a demonstration of the kingdom of God invading and displacing the kingdom of darkness. It was a tangible expression of divine power, breaking the chains of spiritual oppression and setting the captives free. Today, in an increasingly secular Western culture, these ideas may seem primitive or superstitious. We prefer psychological explanations for mental illness, medical explanations for physical disease, sociological explanations for destructive behavior. And certainly, these explanations have value and have produced real benefits. We have made great strides in understanding the human mind and body, and we have developed effective treatments for a wide range of conditions. But perhaps we have lost something by completely discarding the spiritual dimension of reality. Perhaps there are battles that are fought on levels that our scientific instruments cannot measure. Influences that operate in ways that our materialist models cannot capture. Perhaps there is a deeper reality that lies beyond the reach of our senses, a realm of spiritual forces that shape our lives in ways we cannot fully comprehend. Mount Hermon is not simply a geographical accident mentioned casually in the narrative of the Watchers. It is a place charged with meaning, both in biblical history and in the mythology of the ancient Near East. It stands majestic on the border between Lebanon, Syria, and Israel, reaching a height of over 9,200 feet above sea level. Its peaks are covered in snow for much of the year, and from its slopes spring the sources that feed the Jordan River. It is a land of dramatic beauty, a place where the heavens seem to touch the earth. In antiquity, it was considered a sacred place, a meeting point between heaven and earth, a threshold where the divine and the human could touch. It was a natural cathedral, a place of awe and wonder. The name Hermon comes from a Semitic root that means consecrated or sanctuary. This already tells us something important. Even before the Watchers chose this place for their fateful oath, it was already recognized as a sacred space. The Canaanites built sanctuaries on its slopes dedicated to Baal and other deities. The Phoenicians called it the Mountain of Baal Hermon, associating it with the storm god who dwelled in the heights. The mountain was seen as a conduit to the divine realm. For ancient cultures, high mountains were naturally places of encounter with the divine, closer to heaven, above the mundane concerns of the valley. They were seen as places of power, where the veil between worlds was thin. That the Watchers specifically chose Hermon to take their oath was not accidental. They needed a place that was liminal, that was between worlds, that already had a reputation for being a point of contact with the supernatural. By gathering there and making their binding pact, they were, in a sense, profaning a sacred place, taking a space that should have been used for legitimate worship and turning it into the stage for a cosmic rebellion. They were turning a sanctuary into a den of iniquity. The Book of Enoch specifies about this, and all together went and bound themselves mutually with anathema upon it in Mount Hermon. The oath was not simply a casual promise. It was a solemn pact sealed with curses upon anyone who recanted. It was an act of solidarity in transgression, a decision to fall together so that none could be singled out individually as the only guilty one. They were united in their defiance, bound together by their shared commitment to break the divine law. And the place where they took this oath was marked forever. Later Jewish tradition would remember Hermon not only as a beautiful mountain, but as the place where the great corruption began. Interestingly, Mount Hermon appears in other biblical contexts, some of them positive. Psalm 133 speaks of the dew of Hermon that descends upon the mountains of Zion, using the mountain as a symbol of blessing and freshness. The Song of Songs mentions Hermon as a place of beauty and majesty. And in the New Testament, many scholars believe that the transfiguration of Jesus occurred on Mount Hermon, not on Mount Tabor, as later tradition suggests. If this is correct, there is a deep poetic symmetry at play. The place where the Watchers took their oath of rebellion becomes the place where Jesus is revealed in glory, where Moses and Elijah appear to speak with him, where the voice of the Father declares, "This is my beloved Son." It would be a redemption of the space itself, a reconsecration of what had been profaned. The mountain would be cleansed of its dark history and transformed into a beacon of divine light. The geography of Hermon also has practical significance for the narrative. From its heights, the Watchers could literally look down over the entire region, observing the human villages in the valleys, seeing the women who awakened their desire. It was the perfect place for Watchers, for observers, who were supposed to maintain distance while fulfilling their function. They had a panoramic view of human life, but they were not meant to interfere. But that same height, that same privileged position of observation, became the scene of their fall. They descended from Hermon not only geographically, but also spiritually, coming down from their elevated position to mingle with humanity in ways that never should have occurred. They succumbed to the temptations of the flesh, abandoning their divine calling for the fleeting pleasures of the world. In the time of the Second Temple, the area around Hermon was associated with demonic activity. Josephus, the Jewish historian of the 1st century, mentions that the region of Caesarea Philippi, situated at the foot of Hermon, was known for its pagan shrines and occult practices. It was a place where the worship of false gods thrived. Jesus led his disciples precisely to this region when he asked them, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was no coincidence that this crucial declaration of the identity of Jesus occurred in a place associated with dark powers. It was a declaration of spiritual war, an assertion of authority in enemy territory. Jesus was claiming his rightful place as the King of Kings, even in the heart of the enemy's domain. Today, Mount Hermon remains a place of strategic and symbolic significance. Politically, it is a point of dispute between Israel and Syria, with important security implications. Religiously, it continues to be venerated by various traditions, and for those familiar with the Enochian narrative, it remains as a physical reminder of how choices made in a moment can have consequences that resonate through millennia. The mountain stands as a silent witness to the unfolding drama of human history. The mountain itself is blameless, of course. It is simply rock, snow, and vegetation, but places carry memory, and Hermon carries the memory of an oath that changed the course of history, of a decision that triggered catastrophic consequences, of a moment when celestial beings chose to cross a border that they never should have crossed. It serves as a constant reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition and the importance of remaining true to one's divine calling. One of the most fascinating contributions of the Book of Enoch to apocalyptic literature is its detailed description of the structure of the universe. It is not content with vague references to heaven and hell. Instead, it offers an elaborate cosmology with multiple levels of reality, each with its own function and inhabitants. It paints a vivid picture of the cosmos, a realm teeming with life and activity. For modern readers, accustomed to thinking of the universe in terms of measurable physical space, this cosmology may seem strange or even primitive. But if we understand it as a map of spiritual realities rather than as a literal astronomical diagram, it reveals a sophisticated understanding of how the visible and the invisible are intertwined. It is a way of expressing the interconnectedness of all things, the way that the physical world is merely a reflection of a deeper spiritual reality. According to the Book of Enoch, there are multiple heavens, generally enumerated as 7, although some traditions speak of 3 or 10. Each heaven has distinct characteristics and serves different purposes. They are arranged in a hierarchy, with each level increasing in glory and proximity to the divine. The first heaven is the closest to earth, the realm of the air where birds fly and clouds form. It is here that the Watchers originally had their station, observing the earth from a distance that allowed them to see without being seen, to care without interfering. They were meant to be guardians, not manipulators. The second heaven, according to some traditions, is where the fallen Watchers were imprisoned, a place of darkness and waiting. They are held captive in a state of spiritual isolation, awaiting the final judgment. The third heaven is described by Paul in 2 Corinthians as the place where he was caught up and heard ineffable words. Enochic traditions describe it as containing both paradise and the place of torment, a kind of intermediate state where souls await final judgment. It is a place of transition, where the dead are sorted according to their deeds. The higher heavens become progressively more glorious and closer to the divine presence, until reaching the seventh heaven, where the throne of God himself resides, surrounded by seraphim and cherubim, in a place of eternal worship and unimaginable glory. This is the ultimate destination of the righteous, a place of perfect peace and unending joy. But the Enochian cosmology is not limited to the heavens. It also describes in detail the subterranean places, the abysses where spiritual transgressors are imprisoned. Dudiel, where Raphael casts Azazel, is described as a desert of rough stones and absolute darkness, a place of total isolation where time loses meaning. It is a desolate and barren wasteland, a perfect representation of the spiritual emptiness of those who are imprisoned there. Dudiel is not simply an underground dungeon. It is a dimension of existence characterized by absence. Absence of light, of company, of hope. It is the perfect opposite of heaven, where everything is presence, communion, and glory. It is a place where the soul is stripped bare of all earthly attachments, forced to confront the consequences of its actions. Enoch also describes places of intermediate judgment, spaces where the souls of the dead await the final resurrection. These places are divided according to the moral character of their occupants. There are compartments for the righteous, where they wait in peace and anticipation. There are compartments for the ordinary wicked, where they experience torment proportional to their sins. And there are special compartments for those whose wickedness was so extreme that it requires immediate punishment, even before the final judgment. They are subjected to a more intense and prolonged suffering, a foretaste of the eternal damnation that awaits them. This moral geography of the afterlife profoundly influenced later Jewish and Christian thought, providing the conceptual framework for ideas about Hades, Sheol, Paradise, and Gehenna. It shaped the way people understood the fate of the dead and the consequences of their choices. Particularly fascinating is the Enochian description of the confines of the earth, the places where the physical cosmos meets the spiritual. Enoch is taken to the ends of the world, where he sees the gates through which the sun and the moon emerge, the storehouses where the winds, the snow, the hail, and the dew are kept. He sees the roots of the mountains and the foundations of the earth. He sees the tree of life, whose fruit will be given to the righteous in the age to come, and the tree of knowledge, whose fruit caused the fall of Adam. These are places of mystery and wonder, where the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural become blurred. These descriptions should not be understood as literal geography, but as a way of expressing truths about how the cosmos works, about how the natural and the supernatural are interwoven, about how every aspect of the physical creation has a spiritual dimension. They are metaphors for the unseen forces that shape our world. The winds are not simply movements of air. They are beings or forces with purpose and direction. The stars are not simply balls of burning gas. They are angels or are associated with angels, and their behavior reflects spiritual realities. Everything in the cosmos is imbued with meaning and purpose. This way of seeing the world may seem strange to the modern mindset, which has been trained to strictly separate the physical from the spiritual, the natural from the supernatural. We have become accustomed to viewing the world through a scientific lens, focusing on empirical data and measurable phenomena. But perhaps we have lost something in that separation. Perhaps the Enochian worldview, with all its strangeness, captures a truth that our materialist science overlooks. That the universe is not simply matter in motion, but that it is saturated with meaning, purpose, and intentionality. The Enochian cosmology offers a more holistic and integrated view of reality, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of all things and the presence of the divine in every aspect of creation. The Enochian cosmology also includes a temporal dimension, in addition to the spatial one. It describes not only where things are, but when they will happen. There is a cosmic calendar, a divine plan that unfolds through the ages. History is not cyclical, as in many ancient cosmologies, but linear, moving from creation toward an eschatological climax. This Enochian view presented a profound departure from the cyclical understanding of time prevalent in many ancient cultures. Instead of history repeating itself in endless loops, it marched forward with purpose, guided by a divine hand. This linear perspective placed immense significance on each moment, each era, as part of a grand, unfolding narrative with a preordained conclusion. There are cosmic eras or weeks, periods of time during which specific purposes are fulfilled. The antediluvian era was one, the current era is another, and a future era will come when all things are renewed. This linear understanding of history, with its emphasis on purpose and destiny, was revolutionary in the ancient world and became one of the distinctive features of Judeo-Christian thought. Imagine the impact of this radical shift. Instead of being trapped in an eternal recurrence, humanity was participating in a divine drama, moving inexorably towards a final resolution. This concept of cosmic weeks further broke down history into manageable, purpose-driven segments, each with its own unique role to play in the overarching plan. The pre-flood world served as a stark example, followed by the present age, and the promise of a future golden age where everything is made anew. echoing in the prophecies of a new heaven and a new earth. This revolutionary notion provided a framework for understanding not only the past, but also the present and future, fueling a sense of purpose and destiny that would become a cornerstone of Judeo-Christian thought. For Enoch, being taken through this cosmology was not merely celestial tourism. It was an education, an initiation into the mysteries of how the universe truly works. And the purpose of this education was not to satisfy his curiosity, but to equip him for his role as a witness and recorder. This wasn't a sightseeing tour through the heavens for Enoch. It was an intense, immersive educational experience. He was being initiated into the very mechanics of the universe, privy to the secrets of creation, time, and destiny. This wasn't academic study, but a profound spiritual and intellectual awakening, designed to transform him from an ordinary man into a pivotal figure in the cosmic narrative. His role as witness and recorder was crucial. He was to document this knowledge, preserving it for future generations who would need this understanding to navigate their own place in the grand scheme of things. He needed to understand the structure of the cosmos in order to understand where the rebellion of the Watchers fit into the larger scheme of things, in order to see how the judgment that was to come was necessary to restore order, in order to transmit to future generations not only facts but understanding. Throughout the narrative of the Watchers, there is a group whose voices are rarely heard, but whose presence is absolutely central: the human women who united with the fallen angels. The text simply calls them the daughters of men, a generic designation that strips them of individuality and agency. Enoch's cosmic education was designed to provide him with the context necessary to understand the unfolding crisis. He needed to grasp the structure of the universe, the forces at play, and the divine plan to appreciate the gravity of the Watchers' rebellion. Only then could he understand the necessity of the coming judgment, a cosmic reset button, and effectively communicate this understanding to future generations. He wasn't merely preserving facts. He was conveying wisdom, insight, and a deeper comprehension of the universe's workings. Yet, in this grand narrative, a crucial group remained largely voiceless: the human women who became entangled with the fallen angels. These women, simply referred to as the daughters of men, are reduced to a generic label, stripped of their individual identities and agency. They are presented as a collective, their stories and perspectives largely absent from the historical record. We are not given their names, we do not hear their thoughts, we do not know their motivations. They are presented primarily as objects of desire, as the catalyst that triggers the fall of the Watchers, but not as subjects with their own stories. This absence of female voice in the narrative is significant and problematic and deserves to be examined with care. The central question is, were these women innocent victims of seduction or rape by supernatural beings infinitely more powerful than they? Or were they willing participants, perhaps even active seducers, who used their beauty to attract the Watchers? Who were these women? What were their names, their dreams, their fears? We are denied access to their inner lives, their thoughts, and their motivations. They are primarily presented as objects of desire, passive figures who sparked the downfall of the Watchers, rather than active participants with their own agency and stories to tell. This lack of a female perspective is not merely an oversight. It is a significant and problematic omission that demands closer scrutiny. Were these women innocent victims, powerless against the seductive charm and supernatural power of the fallen angels? Were they coerced, manipulated, or even subjected to acts of violence by beings far superior to them? Or were they willing participants, perhaps even active in their pursuit of the Watchers, leveraging their beauty and allure to gain influence or access to forbidden knowledge? The answer is far from simple, and the silence surrounding their experiences leaves room for speculation and interpretation. The answer is not simple, and different traditions have interpreted their role in very different ways. Some later rabbinical traditions present them as seductresses, women who deliberately adorned themselves and behaved in provocative ways to attract the attention of the Watchers. The narrative surrounding these women becomes even more complex when considering different interpretations across various traditions. Some later rabbinical sources portray them as active seductresses, intentionally using their beauty and charm to ensnare the Watchers. They are depicted as deliberately adorning themselves, engaging in provocative behaviors, and consciously manipulating the fallen angels to achieve their own desires. This perspective paints a picture of these women as strategic actors, consciously wielding their feminine wiles to attract the attention of supernatural beings. According to these interpretations, the women bear part of the blame for the fall because they awaken desires that otherwise would have remained latent. This reading has been used historically to justify misogynistic attitudes, blaming women for male lust and presenting them as dangerous temptresses whose beauty is a spiritual trap. It is an interpretation that must be rejected firmly, not only because it is unjust, but because it contradicts the internal logic of the narrative itself. The Book of Enoch is clear that the initiative came from the Watchers, not the women. In this narrative, the women are assigned a portion of the blame for the Watchers' transgression. They are viewed as the catalysts who ignited the angels' forbidden desires that would have remained dormant had the women not provoked them. This interpretation has been historically weaponized to reinforce misogynistic attitudes, placing the responsibility for male lust and misconduct squarely on the shoulders of women. They are portrayed as dangerous temptresses, their beauty and allure a spiritual snare that leads men astray. However, this interpretation is deeply flawed and must be firmly rejected, not only because it is inherently unjust and perpetuates harmful stereotypes, but because it fundamentally contradicts the internal logic of the Book of Enoch itself. The text makes it explicitly clear that the initiative originated with the Watchers, not the women. It was Samjaza who proposed the plan. It was the Watchers who made the oath. It was they who deliberately descended. The narrative unequivocally points to Samjaza, the leader of the Watchers, as the architect of the plan to descend to earth and consort with human women. It was the Watchers themselves who collectively swore an oath to carry out this transgression. They deliberately, and of their own volition, descended from the heavenly realm to pursue their desires on earth. The women did not ascend to heaven to seduce the angels. The angels came down to earth to take the women. The verb used in Genesis 6 suggests unilateral action on the part of the sons of God. They took wives for themselves. It does not say that the women offered themselves. It says that they were taken. The women did not initiate contact. They did not travel to the heavens to seduce the angels. The angels, driven by their own desires, descended to earth to take the women. The language used in Genesis 6, the phrase, "they took wives for themselves," further underscores the unilateral nature of the angels' actions. There is no mention of the women offering themselves, of their consent or agency in the matter. The text emphasizes that they were taken, implying a lack of choice or resistance. This suggests at a minimum a massive imbalance of power and possibly coercion or direct violence. Imagine the situation from the perspective of a woman at that time. A being of supernatural beauty and power appears and expresses interest in her. How could she reject him? What real options did she have? In a patriarchal society where women already had little power of decision over their own lives, where marriages were arranged by parents and brothers, how much agency could a woman exercise in the face of an angelic being? And if, as some texts suggest, the Watchers used their superior knowledge to seduce through promises of power, eternal beauty, or secret wisdom, would that not be a form of manipulation that invalidates any apparent consent? This one-sided action speaks volumes about the power dynamics at play. The imbalance of power was immense, potentially involving coercion or even outright violence. Imagine the situation from the perspective of a woman living in that era. A being of unimaginable beauty and power, a supernatural figure, appears and expresses an interest in her. How could she possibly reject such an advance? What real options would she have at her disposal? In a deeply patriarchal society where women already possessed limited autonomy and control over their own lives, where marriages were typically arranged by fathers and brothers with little regard for the woman's own desires, how much agency could a woman truly exercise when confronted with an angelic being? Furthermore, if, as some texts hint, the Watchers employed their superior knowledge and abilities to seduce these women, making promises of power, eternal beauty, or access to secret wisdom, wouldn't that constitute a form of manipulation that effectively invalidates any semblance of consent? These women were operating from a position of inherent vulnerability, and their choices, if any, were likely heavily influenced by the overwhelming power and influence of their supernatural suitors. Furthermore, we must consider the consequences that these women faced. They became pregnant with hybrid beings whose birth was probably traumatic, given the size and unnatural nature of the Nephilim. Some traditions suggest that many died in childbirth, their fragile bodies unable to bear what they were bringing into the world. Those who survived had to raise children who quickly grew into violent monsters who terrorized humanity. What mother could bear to see her child become a man-eater? What psychological and spiritual trauma must these women have experienced? And when the flood came, they perished along with everyone else, punished for a transgression in which they had little or no real choice. There is no narrative of their salvation, no ark that preserves them, no recognition of their suffering. They simply disappear under the waters, silent victims of a cosmic catastrophe they did not cause. Beyond the initial encounter, we must also consider the horrific consequences that these women were forced to endure. They became pregnant with the Nephilim, hybrid offspring whose birth was undoubtedly traumatic, given their extraordinary size and unnatural nature. Some traditions suggest that a significant number of these women perished during childbirth, their fragile bodies unable to withstand the immense strain of bringing such beings into the world. Those who survived faced the daunting task of raising children who rapidly transformed into violent, monstrous figures, terrorizing humanity with their insatiable appetites and destructive tendencies. What mother could possibly bear the pain of witnessing her own child morph into a man-eater, a predator preying on the very people she was meant to protect? What psychological and spiritual trauma must these women have experienced, forced to confront the horrifying reality of their offspring's monstrous nature? And when the cataclysmic flood finally arrived, they perished alongside everyone else, swept away by the waters, punished for a transgression in which they had little to no real choice. There is no narrative of their salvation, no ark to preserve them from the impending doom, no acknowledgement of their immense suffering. They simply disappear beneath the waves, silent and forgotten victims of a cosmic catastrophe that they did not cause, their stories erased from the annals of history. This invisibility of women in the narrative reflects broader patterns in ancient literature, where women frequently appear as objects rather than as subjects, as catalysts for male actions rather than as agents with their own stories. But it also invites us to read between the lines, to imagine the untold stories, to give voice to those who were silenced. This erasure of women from the narrative is not unique to the story of the Watchers. It reflects a broader pattern prevalent in ancient literature, where women are frequently relegated to the role of objects rather than subjects, serving as catalysts for male actions rather than being portrayed as independent agents with their own unique perspectives and experiences. However, this silence also presents an opportunity to challenge the dominant narrative and to actively engage in a process of reimagining and reinterpreting. It invites us to read between the lines, to fill in the gaps, and to imagine the untold stories of these women, giving voice to those who were historically silenced. By acknowledging their absence and actively seeking to understand their perspectives, we can begin to dismantle the patriarchal structures that have historically marginalized and erased female voices from the historical record. What were the names of these women? What did they dream of before the Watchers descended? Did they love the beings who took them, or did they live in constant terror? What lullabies did they sing to their monstrous children? What prayers did they whisper as they watched the world crumble around them? What were their names, these forgotten women? What were their hopes and dreams before the arrival of the Watchers shattered their world? Did they find a semblance of love or connection with the beings who took them, or did they live in constant fear, forced to submit to their supernatural captors? What lullabies did they sing to their monstrous children, knowing the darkness that resided within them? What prayers did they whisper as they watched the world crumble around them, their pleas for mercy lost amidst the cosmic chaos? These are the questions that haunt the margins of the narrative, inviting us to consider the human cost of the Watchers' transgression and the enduring impact of their actions on the lives of these women. There is also another dimension that must be considered. Some modern feminist interpretations have suggested that the narrative of the Watchers can be read as a metaphor for the sexual violence and abuse of power that women have experienced throughout history. Beyond the literal interpretation, there exists another dimension that demands consideration: the potential for the narrative of the Watchers to be understood as a powerful metaphor for the pervasive issue of sexual violence, and the abuse of power that women have endured throughout history. The Watchers, with their superior power and their sense of entitlement to take what they desire, represent all the powerful men who have used their position to exploit vulnerable women. The Nephilim, children of violent unions, represent the generational trauma that results from such violence. And the silence of the women in the text reflects how the voices of survivors of abuse have been historically silenced, ignored, or blamed. The Watchers, with their immense power and their unwavering belief in their own entitlement, can be seen as representing all the powerful figures throughout history who have exploited their positions to prey on vulnerable women. The Nephilim, born from unions rooted in violence and coercion, embody the generational trauma that stems from such abuse, a legacy of pain and suffering that is passed down through generations. And the eerie silence surrounding the women in the text mirrors the historical silencing of survivors of abuse, their voices suppressed, their experiences ignored, and their suffering often dismissed or even blamed on themselves. From this perspective, the story of the Watchers is not just about fallen angels and giants, but about power, consent, and the devastating consequences of crossing boundaries without considering the harm caused to the most vulnerable. It is a story that resonates painfully with the experiences of countless women throughout history and to this day. Viewed through this lens, the story of the Watchers transcends the realm of ancient mythology and becomes a potent commentary on the timeless themes of power, consent, and the devastating consequences that arise when boundaries are crossed without regard for the harm inflicted upon the most vulnerable members of society. It is a narrative that resonates deeply and painfully with the lived experiences of countless women throughout history and continues to echo in the present day, as we grapple with issues of sexual violence, abuse of power, and the struggle for equality and justice. If we are to tell this story with integrity, we must recognize these women not as mere footnotes, but as real people who suffered real consequences for decisions that others made. We must resist the temptation to blame them for awakening desires they did not ask to awaken. And we must listen to the voices that the ancient text silenced by imagining their stories, honoring their suffering, recognizing their humanity. If we are to approach this story with integrity and empathy, we must actively challenge the historical erasure of these women and recognize them not as mere footnotes in a grand cosmic drama, but as real people who suffered profound consequences as a result of decisions made by others. We must resist the pervasive temptation to blame them for awakening desires that they did not ask to awaken, and instead acknowledge the systemic power imbalances that left them vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. We must actively seek to amplify the voices that the ancient text has silenced by engaging in acts of imagination, piecing together their stories from the fragments that remain, honoring their suffering, and ultimately recognizing their inherent humanity. By doing so, we can transform the narrative of the Watchers from a tale of fallen angels and giants into a powerful testament to the resilience and enduring spirit of the women who were caught in the crossfire of a cosmic conflict.